Welcome to the 2014 Heart Conference. We're on the campus of Northland International University, where it's a balmy 7 degrees, so it's warmed up, believe it or not, since yesterday. But we are happy to welcome Justin Taylor, a senior VP at Crossway Books here. Justin, this is your first time at Northland, I believe. What's your impression of the campus? How have you enjoyed yourself here?
Yeah, it's been great. I've heard about it for a number of years, but this is the first time actually being on campus, and a beautiful facility, and love the whole camp and the whole university setting here. So everybody's been very hospitable and encouraging. So I've really enjoyed my time here at Northland.
Great. And we have enjoyed having you here. Last night, Justin gave a great session on John Owen and some of the things he can teach us about sanctification, about pursuing holiness. And I've heard from people all over campus that they were blessed by that. So as you think about John Owen, what are some of the lessons? I don't want you to recap your whole session, but if there are just 2 or 3 points that would be helpful for us to think about when we're thinking about how can John Owen, who lived 400 years ago, help us in the 21st century pursue holiness, pursue God?
Yeah. Well, I think Owen is amazingly relevant. When you read him, obviously there's a distance between us now in the 21st century and him in the 17th century. But 3 things come to mind. Number one, his understanding of the nature of God, the holiness of God, the majesty of God, the beauty of God. You know, the beauty of God is something we don't talk about very much, but he had a vision of who God is, and it wasn't just a monolithic Unitarian vision of God. He thought the Trinity was enormously important to the Christian life, and wrote about how we are to commune with each member of the Trinity. There's communion with the Father, communion with the Son, communion in the Spirit. So his whole understanding of God, it's countercultural. It's different than a lot of the sermons you would hear today. It's life-giving. It's strong, wonderful stuff. Secondly, his emphasis on knowing yourself in relationship to God, knowing that we are, as believers, those who still have indwelling sin remaining within us. His exhortation for us to know yourself, to know who you are, to know what your weaknesses are, to know who you are as a sinner, but also as one who has been saved. That whole approach of coming to God in what he calls deep humiliation is something I think we all need to hear today. And then finally, just his understanding of the gospel. You know, he said you can't ever put to death any sin without the death of Christ. And as we have discussions today in Christian circles about the place of the gospel, the role of the gospel in sanctification, the relationship between law and gospel, I just think Owen has so much to say to us, because on the one hand, he wants to hit really hard. You have to mortify sin. You have to make it your daily task. But he also wants to hit equally as hard the graciousness, the mercifulness, the loveliness of Jesus and the gospel, and how we are continually accepted before him, and how we should avoid hard thoughts of God, thinking of him as a hard father. So that combination of a man who saw the holiness of God, saw the humility that we need, and saw the gospel, the cross of Jesus Christ, as filling the gap between those two, I just think it's enormously relevant for all of us.
That's helpful. And you edited a volume, or co-edited, I should say, a volume on Owen's works on sin and temptation, and that's just an amazing resource, a helpful tool. You've also been involved in editing a number of books. You were the managing editor, I believe, on the ESV Study Bible. So you've worked in Christian publishing for how many years now?
Yeah, 8 years.
8 years you've been at Crossway, and over the course of those 8 years, you've been involved in a number of book projects, and not just from Crossway, but from a number of fine Christian publishers. We're seeing dozens, hundreds maybe, of great Christian books being printed every year. As students and pastors and Christians look at these, they get these catalogs in the mail, or they'll go online and they see all these titles. It can be a little bit overwhelming. How can we as Christians kind of sort through all that and have the ability to know what books we should be reading, what books we should prioritize. So from you who are in Christian publishing, what advice would you have to us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're right. We're seeing a real resurgence. Blogger Tim Challies the other day wrote about how we may be in sort of a golden age of Christian publishing. At the same time, there's a lot of really bad stuff out there too. And if you look at kind of the top selling books, a lot of times they're not the deepest or most substantial books. They oftentimes have a sort of a gimmick to them. So there is good and there is bad out there. I think one encouragement to people is that after a while, you can develop sort of a sixth sense about books. You start to become familiar with publishers, you start to become familiar with authors, and you can just tell without reading a whole book where it's going to go, what it's going to be like, what it's going to argue. I saw a quote the other day, I can't remember who said it, that a bad book is the worst thief of time in the world. And I think that's true. I mean, think about the amount of time it takes to read a book, and if you're reading it and it's a waste of your time. Sometimes we have to read bad books in order to refute them. I try to give most of my reading diet to good books that are going to edify me and instruct me. I think the best advice I could give is to find somebody who is maybe a step ahead of you, whether that's an older student, whether that's a pastor, whether that's a friend, whether that's a parent, whether that's a website like Gospel Coalition, or various blogs that you've come to trust, where you can get a preview for the book, get some analysis of whether it's worth your time or not. The reality is the majority of books today are not going to be read 10 years from now, even if they're still technically in print. So one advice that C.S. Lewis offered was to include the reading of old books just as part of your reading diet. They may be good, they may be bad, but at least they've stuck around and they've influenced people. And so that would be just one encouragement, is don't get so sucked into the tyranny of the urgent and the latest is the greatest and the newest is the best mentality. Our world, every form of advertising kind of pushes that mentality on it, and we can start to absorb that even unaware. So reading older books and trusting other people, and then also just even learning something about publishers. I mean, if you see something published by PNR, Presbyterian Reformed, you're going to know what kind of theological stream that's coming from. And the same can be true with other publishers. That can help orient you to where a book might be going and where they're coming from.
That's helpful, thank you. And I can just say that Crossway Books, where Justin works, is one of those publishers that consistently produces Christ-centered, God-honoring literature. So if you find a Crossway book, odds are it's going to be helpful in some of these ways. So if I can just follow up on reading, one other question. As we read, should we have strategies for reading? And what I mean by that is, do we read every book the same way? Just read each word and kind of think about it? Or especially if we're trying to read in larger quantities, are there different strategies for how we can approach books and how we can use books as tools?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think of reading at several different levels. I heard a quote from David Wells the other day that he has to instruct his students when they're reading Augustine's Confessions to stop reading so quickly, to slow down. Every word counts. Read it more meditatively, read it more slowly. There's other books where you can read it at a pretty normal pace. There's other books where you might want to be underlining and taking notes all throughout it. There's other books where you can read the introduction, read the conclusion, and essentially skim it, or maybe just read one chapter or two chapters. I know some people get caught up in it. Once they start a book, they have to finish it or they feel guilty. I struggle actually with finishing books. I read too many books that I don't finish. But I think we need to learn to read widely and learn to read at different levels. If you read every book in such a way that you're underlining every other sentence, it's going to slow you down a great deal. There are books like that to read, but some books you want to just kind of get the big idea. A lot of books, especially contemporary books, have one good main idea, and they spend the rest of the book telling it to you in 20 different ways. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you know that pretty quickly, it will help you decide that you don't have to read X book on the Christian life in the same way that you would read Augustine's Confessions. Augustine's Confessions is 1,600 years old, and people are still getting more out of it on multiple readings. You can't say that with the majority of books published today.
That's true. So if you move from the reading of books to the reading of blogs, you have a blog that's widely read, Between Two Worlds, and you put a lot of content on there, and there are hundreds, thousands of Christian blogs out there. What would your advice be for people who maybe don't read any blogs or maybe read too much blogs? How should we approach in 2014 this whole phenomenon called Christian blogging?
Yeah, and I think Christian blogging, in 2014 is changing just a little bit. I don't think it's going away. I think people are actually reading shorter things than blogs. Blogs has become long form now, and everything's moving towards Twitter and Facebook to some degree. The main criteria that I would recommend, I don't think somebody needs to feel guilty if they never read a blog. It's a tool of edification. There's nothing magical about the medium. If you go to it and find that it's just encouraging you to waste your time, it's just cute cat videos. If you watch,
isn't that what you put on your blog?
Well,
mostly?
yeah, I think I'll get too much hate mail if I make fun of cat videos that people watch online. But you can spend a lot of time. Anything's addictive, and anything can be a waste of time in a not an immoral way. What I mean by that is that going online to look at pornography or to read salacious material, obviously that's just cut and dry sinful. But there's a great middle ground of you're not doing anything inherently sinful, but you can just spend a lot of time and it's not necessarily instructive or edifying. There's a place for just seeing stuff that's fun and checking out sports and all that kind of thing, which I do. We just need to guard our hearts there that doesn't go overboard. But I would say the main criteria that I try to have on my blog, which I don't know if I always succeed, but I try to post stuff that I think is interesting and edifying. And if it's both interesting and edifying, it makes it onto my blog. Again, I don't do that perfectly. But that's the sort of thing I think you should try to be reading. If I feel like my blog reading, I'm being instructed, I'm learning something, I'm being encouraged, I'm being convicted, I'm being pointed towards a resource. But if you find yourself just kind of spinning your wheels and spending a lot of time but not having much to take away from it, probably
Sure.
need to come back.
And just if we move from reading to writing, so just quickly, if there are some who are watching this who maybe they want to be a better writer, or maybe they want to publish a book, or they want to just learn how to write for their own sake, do you have advice for writers? Should all Christians aspire to be writers?
Yeah, I think at some level all Christians probably should aspire to be writers, which I think is different from saying all Christians should aspire to be published writers. But I do think the discipline and skill of writing is something all of us need. We all need to grow in. Very few of us are better thinkers than writers. We don't oftentimes even know what we think on something. We may have a vague idea of what we think on an issue until we actually try to write it down. So the process of writing actually has a very clarifying effect for our minds, I think. Going back to blogging, I think that there's an opportunity where you can get writing out there. It may not be a huge audience, but you can make it a discipline to do it every day. Get feedback, see if it gains any traction. Almost every book or resource you look at on writing advice will say two things. That you're not going to be a good writer unless you're a reader, and you're not going to be a good writer until you write and you write and you write and you rewrite. And I think both of those are true. Both of those require a lot of time. There's no kind of magical tricks out there to become a better writer, except if you have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. And it's like any skill, you get better as you work on it, get feedback from it, understand what's what's resonating with people, what's not resonating with people. The biggest thing I look for in writing is it interesting? Do I want to keep reading? And is it clear? Or do I have to stop and pause and look off in the sky and think, I could have meant this or could have meant that? Just don't make me guess, and make me be interested enough that it keeps the narrative moving along, whether you're talking about academic writing or very popular level writing.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Justin, so much for your time with us. We really appreciate your teaching, your investment in our students, and so many pastors here. And we appreciate your ministry at Crossway. I'm so thankful for the ESV Study Bible and for all the good resources that Crossway is putting out. So thank you. We appreciate it and pray that God will continue to bless your ministry. And if you want to hear Justin's talk from last night on John Owen or any of the workshops or any of the speakers from the Heart Conference, go to ni.edu/Heart Conference. You can find media of all the events, of all the sessions. And I think it'll be a blessing to you and your church as you learn, as we pursue God's holiness and his call on us as individuals and us as a church. Thanks a lot.